Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Gillespie. I'm the Executive Director here at the American Precision Museum. Welcome to the speaker series with Jeff. He's the author of Arming the World. We're talking about how gun manufacturing really helped change the way we think about manufacturing today through the American system of manufacturing that was born here. It's great to see some of our donors every so often I get to connect with again, so I think that's great. We have our gift shop is open tonight. There's some food, so just come and enjoy yourselves. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. There's staff around, and feel free to wander through the museum as well. So let's give a good hand for Jeff.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very kind. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It's the old joke goes, my job's to talk and yours is to listen, and I hope I finish before you do. So thanks for having me here. The museum is a very special place for all of us, particularly for me. Again and again, my book talks about Robbins and Lawrence in this very building. So it's very appropriate and very humbling in a way to be here to speak with you. The book, as you may know, is about the American small arms industry between 1850 and 1885, give or take a few years. I called it Arming the World because, at least in the last part of that period, most nations came to our country to buy their military rifles, gun-making machinery, and ammunition. I got into the subject in a funny way, and any of you who've read the introduction to the book will know what it is. I was an undergraduate at Brown back in the 1970s, and a beloved professor of mine, the late Norman Rich, gave a lecture on the Russo-Turkish War and why it is that to this day Russia does not have a warm water port. And the answer is that its last chance came in 1878, and it lost the chance because of a very critical battle in Bulgaria at a place called Plevna. And what made it funny was that the rifles at Plevna had been made in Providence, Rhode Island. And 50 years ago, Providence was more of a regional whipping boy than it is now, because it was a declining Rust Belt city. We all thought it was very funny. I chatted with him afterwards, and he said, you know, somebody ought to look into that. Why did they choose rifles in America? How did they pay for them? And isn't this strange? And it did change the course of history. So I took him up on that. I did some research, and after a lot of sleuthing that I briefly described in the beginning of the book, found the people who had the documents of the man who ran the company, which is Providence Tool Company, and they let me read, although not copy, the documents every other Sunday. I turned that into a master's thesis, but in the course of so doing, learned that this was the tip of the iceberg, that there were many other arms companies, that the scope of the U.S. effort was much bigger, and I thought it was fascinating. I wanted to continue it, but reality intervened. I went off to law school, and it wasn't until COVID in retirement a few years ago I had the time to go back to complete what I had started, and that is this book. And by the way, I should say, and I'm very sorry I failed at the very outset of this talk to say my editor is here. It's my wife Sandra, who's sitting in the back, and to the extent the book is shorter, more to the point, easier to read, it is her doing, not mine. What makes this interesting, or made it interesting to me, was this was an era where there was revolutionary change in weaponry. At the same time, there was global uncertainty, and the balance of political and military power in Europe was shifting. And so there were, between the mid-1854 and 1878, there were 5 major wars in Europe, and also our Civil War. And everyone was affected profoundly by changes in weapon technology. But the truth was, and that's why I'm happy we're here, the improvements in weaponry really came from changes in the way the weapons were made. The technological revolution is called interchangeable parts, more accurately, the American system of manufacturing. But the word interchangeable parts gets things backwards. The idea of having mechanical parts that could be swapped for each other is actually a pretty old one. There was a Swedish man making clocks that way in the 1600s. The difficulty was, at a time when everything was made by hand, it was almost impossible to make parts that interchange without an extraordinary amount of cost and expense. But interchangeable parts really was a revolution in machinery, because it was only when people realized that to make them interchangeable you had to make them with machines that people began studying machines to make parts. The modern incarnation of it is a product of the French Enlightenment. It started in the probably 1770s. And 1780s, a French inventor named Honoré Blanc had a workshop outside of Paris where, with various machines adapted from woodworking, he started making metal parts for the Charleville musket, which was the musket that armed George Washington's troops in our Revolution. Our minister to France at the time was Thomas Jefferson, and we all know how much he liked gadgets. He heard of Honoré Blanc, took a carriage out to the workshop, was amazed at what Blanc had done, wrote everyone from John Jay to John Hancock to Henry Knox to James Monroe, "You've got to read this," and he tried to hire Blanc to come to America to work for the War Department. Blanc said, "No, things are great here in Paris," and they weren't. He nearly got his head chopped off. He should have taken the offer when he could have, but he didn't. Nonetheless, Jefferson popularized it and began lobbying for it. One way or the other, Eli Whitney learned of it, and there were a cadre of French artillery officers who stayed here after their service in our Revolutionary War, who founded West Point, who were lobbying for this all along. And as a result, in 1815, after the War of 1812, Congress passed a law ordering the Ordnance Department to set up a system of regulations for the University of Manufacturers of all arms. So in the U.S., and only in the U.S., did interchangeable parts become the law. This is the Springfield Armory. You've all, I'm sure, read about it, probably have been there. They have a great museum. It was probably the cutting edge for this. It took Springfield 25 years to actually realize interchangeable parts, and maybe even more than that. But there was a great technological ecosystem between Springfield, Windsor, Chicopee Falls, other places where machinists and mechanics came and went, and machines were invented, bought, sold, swapped, and so on. But all eyes were on Springfield. Not just because it was the federal armory, but that law I just read to you meant that whenever the government let out a contract for arms to anybody, they had to be interchangeable too. Not just with themselves, but with everyone else who was making that gun. So interchangeability was exported from Springfield, but what was really exported was the reliance on these tools, which we now know are called machine tools. And of course, nowhere was that more pronounced than in the building we are in right now. The first true interchangeable federal guns were the Model 1841 rifle and the Model 1842 Springfield musket. But they were actually the result of enormous effort across New England. I have the image and start the book with the Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851, which also is featured in the exhibits here at the museum. That was the first World Fair. It was when England, or Great Britain, was going to show off its power and how advanced it was. The U.S. got a sort of Siberia-like corner and lived up to the expectations by exporting very disappointing exhibits, such that the British press was making fun of it and called it the Prairie, because nobody would go there. But in July 1851, a few things happened in quick succession. First of all, there was a test of reaping machines, and that's where Cyrus McCormick's Reaper showed up. And it wiped out everybody, and the British said, "Good God, agriculture is going to be changed forever. And then they had a big regatta, and a bunch of wealthy guys from New York brought their yacht, the America, over and cleaned everyone's clock, and that was the beginning of the America Cup. People started going to the exhibit, and there, of course, they ran into one of the supreme showmen of all time, Samuel Colt, who was there, showing off his revolvers. And Colt had laid the ground by making extravagant gifts of revolvers to important people, but you could go there and shoot them. And before you knew it, Prince Albert, who was the Prince Consort of Queen Victoria, and the Duke of Wellington and everyone else was in line to blast away with Samuel Colt's revolvers. I think they were probably shooting blanks, but he didn't care. And it was, of course, a wonderful phenomenon. But it was the most radical thing, though, wasn't that. And the military men who came to the exhibition were somewhat agape at a display case at the back of the exhibition by a company no one had ever heard of, from a place no one had ever been, Robbins and Lawrence from Windsor, Vermont, that had a set of rifles with parts made to interchange. Now, the British at this time were facing the Crimean War. They knew a war with Russia over power over Turkey, because this was something we're going to spend some time on, was in the wings. Their system of making guns couldn't produce guns fast enough, and they were adapting to a new type of rifled musket we call the mini gun, mini ball. They called something else, it makes no difference, and they needed to figure out how to make it better. They sent a commission over, two actually, but one came over in 1854, went around trying to figure out where to go. Finally, the commandant at Springfield, General Ripley, sent him ultimately to Hartford. Colt wouldn't help them. They went to the new Sharps Armory and ran into a man named Richard Lawrence, who said, all these machines come from Windsor. So they came here, and this is pretty familiar to you all. This is where we are, and they couldn't believe it. They bought $45,000, and remember that would be, you've got to multiply that by at least 30 to put it in today's dollars, of milling machines alone from Robbins and Lawrence, not to mention gauges, fixtures, jigs, and all the paraphernalia you need to realize the American system of manufacture. They spent all their money. They bought Blanchard stocking machines, and there actually is a Blanchard stocking machine in the back. You may have seen it. They bought drop forges and drill presses, and that became the core of the famous Royal Small Arms factory at Enfield. They didn't stop there. They actually hired away dozens of American machinists and sent them to England too. So for the first period of time of that armory, it was not only American machines, it was Americans that were in this famous place. Robbins and Lawrence, just to drive home the point, was the home of any number of famous people. Maybe you can identify all four of these. From the left, it's Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson, who met here. It's the first of the Smith and Wesson partnerships was formed here, this building. Next, Benjamin Tyler Henry, who invented the Winchester, or perfected the Winchester rifle, also here. Far right is Hiram Berdan, somewhat of a scoundrel, but very key in the history because he not only got credit for the Berdan rifle, which the Russians used, but also for the Berdan cartridge, which was the first super successful centerfire metallic cartridge. But as I said, what really makes it wasn't the guns, it was the machines. And this is a family tree done about a century ago by Professor Joseph Rowe at Yale, just showing how the intellectual input or the intellectual basis of Robbins and Lawrence went everywhere. And you'll notice that we have the Enfield gun, he called it it's really the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. Down over there is the Providence Tool Works, really Providence Tool Company. Sharps Rifle, which again, company, not works. Lamson, Goodnow, and Yale, a big contractor during the American Civil War, and some of their guns are indeed back. And so it goes all the way down. Almost anywhere you go in New England, you can trace back to here. And of course, the British saw that, and that's why they bought so many machines here. Unfortunately for Robbins and Lawrence, the British also put in an order for 20,000 guns, which Robbins and Lawrence couldn't fulfill because of a drought in Pennsylvania, which stopped the sawmills that cut the blanks for the stocks. They went bankrupt, and the British government actually owned Robbins and Lawrence and Sharps for a while till they sold them off. As we mentioned, another key figure we just talked about was Samuel Colt. I was going to say he needs no introduction, but people say that and introduce him anyway. He refined the revolver. It wasn't new. There were old revolvers centuries ago, but he actually made it work. But more to the point, he mechanized the production and built this armory, which is still there. If you drive up, I think it was I-91, it's on the west side, you can still see it. And what made it special was this. Those are milling machines, probably Robbins and Lawrence milling machines. There's one of them right through that wall. That what Colt's chief engineer, Elisha Root, did was realize that the delay in machining was setting up each machine, setting the tool, measuring the tool. He said, well, why don't we just have a lot of machines and no setup? So with any part, you'd start with one machine, pass it to the next, pass it to the next, pass it to the next. And because he was making interchangeable parts, or Colts were actually uniform, with a slight distinction, it was the first true assembly line. And you can see it here, although it's a confusing jungle of shafting and belts. And the shafting, by the way, we all know too about, is in the next room. You can go look at the shafting here, which came from the big water wheel that was in the basement of this building. Colt was one of the first people to realize that the arms industry could be international. He cultivated the Russians and even went to the coronation of Tsar Alexander II. Got a lot of orders for revolvers. He refurbished some muskets for Russia, sold them some gun-making machinery. And to celebrate his success, he put this dome on top of his armory. It's a Russian onion dome, and maybe if you've driven up 91, you've seen it. It's still there, pretty much at eye level because the road's elevated. On the top is a golden colt, apparently modeled on Alexander the Great's horse Bucephalus, which when someone attacked Alexander the Great, the horse broke the lance off. And so the message is a good colt will save your life. But the real centerpiece remained the Springfield Armory. And when the Civil War broke out, even though there were substantial armories, there were not nearly enough guns to arm the North or the South. It was exacerbated in the North because the last Secretary of War before the Civil War was a Virginian who sent an enormous volume of guns to the South, and he was suspected of doing so out of bad motives. There are two sides to that, but the fact was there were not enough guns. About probably 2 million arms were imported to the North and the South between 1861 and maybe 1863 from Europe. Many of them were garbage, and there's a lot of arguments about that. Some were good, but basically every obsolete musket in Europe found a home here. But the Ordnance Department under General Ripley ramped up Springfield. Before the war, it made 800 muskets. These are rifled muskets a month. By 1865, it was 800 a day. He also let out arms contracts to people who could make them, including in this building to the successor of Robbins and Lawrence, and thereby, and these were lucrative contracts, he promised them a profit if they deliver on time, and this caused an exponential expansion of the arms industry, such that by the end of the war, the North was making 5,000 weapons a day, the South was making 100. In fact, they stopped making muskets because they had so many of them. They were using in the North old muskets to corduroy roads, and because the new breech loaders were coming along, and that was going to be the weapon of the future. That probably in and of itself decided the Civil War, not that they were used that much, but the South and the Europeans could not make breech loaders because they didn't have the American system of manufacturing. They'd never mastered the method, because the more complex the gun, the more necessary are machine tools. And so if you're not on the right road with the machine tools, you will never make the guns. Anyhow, after the war, there was a brief pause as everyone wondered about the future. Their big customer was gone. The government started dumping at distressed prices its guns. It would sell you a Sharps rifle for $5. And a lot of gun companies just went out of business. But pretty soon, the ones that stayed in it had this realization. The Europeans were hell-bent on killing each other. They each needed the best guns they could get, and the only place to get them was here. So they began looking abroad. And every gun company sent salesmen overseas. Samuel Remington, who we're going to meet in a minute, moved there. And then there were private dealers. I have this up. This is a sporting goods store in downtown Manhattan that was the biggest gun dealer in the world, Schuyler, Hartley, and Graham. But it also sold Masonic paraphernalia, sporting rifles, and other things too. But you could go in the back and get 200,000 rifles if that's what you were interested in buying. It was presided over by a man named Marcellus Hartley, who was hired by Lincoln during the Civil War, given the rank of brigadier general, and sent to Europe to buy guns. And he had this cat and mouse game with his Confederate counterparts. It was very successful, came back, and then got into the gun business in this way. But let's see, come on, let's advance here. But it wasn't just guns. I mean, here are two factories in Hartford. Can you make out this one? Gun making, Pratt & Whitney. It was a gun machinery company. That's how it got started. There were two mechanics from Colt that started it, and they pursued it below it as the innards of Billings and Spencer. Pratt & Whitney in the early 1870s sold in today's dollars about $60 million worth of gun-making machinery to Prussia, and built or equipped the armories at Spandau, Erfurt, and Danzig. And the dies for it were made by Billings and Spencer. They made 42 tons of dies. So the Germans rearmed not with American guns, but with American machinery. Another great export was ammunition. This is what an ammunition plant looked like in 1872. We're going to circle back to this, but it's quite interesting. First of all, you'll notice the workers are women. And that's because they were more dexterous. Those cones are full of gunpowder, and the gunpowder is being loaded into shells by these ladies. There are machines next to them that put in the bullet, in the lubricant, and finally put in the primer, which is a bird-end primer, and then these men haul them away. This plant could make 400,000 cartridges a day at the time this was made. Working in a gun factory had its dangers. Working in a cartridge factory would kill you. Although this one, which is United Metallic Cartridge, which was owned by Marcellus Hartley, the man we just talked about, had a very good safety record. Oliver Winchester, who was also in the ammunition business, had at least 2 of his plants blow up during the Civil War. I think may have been 3. And the U.S. Ordnance Department suffered a catastrophic explosion in Washington that killed almost the entire workforce, which again were women and some boys, the boys usually being orphans or children who lost their fathers in the war. In fact, they built the ammo plants with thick walls and thin roofs so that when they did blow up, the walls would still be there and you could get back in business without any delay. This guy was the most successful of all, Samuel Remington. He was the youngest of the 3 Remington brothers who inherited their dad's company when he died in a carriage accident in 1861. Remington started as a barrel maker, moved into the gun business, and then decided to really jump into it. When it got the patents on this rifle or breech mechanism called the rolling block, It's called a rolling block because the two parts roll forward and backward. Very strong, easy to make, simple, and they like to say it was soldier-proof because gun makers and ordnance officers realize something that you never see in the movies, and that is the average soldier is scared to death when he is standing there, and getting him to actually load his gun properly and shoot it is a wildly difficult thing to do. Therefore, simplicity was everything, and Remington, knowing that a lot of the countries buying the guns would have a fairly unsophisticated military, did very well with this. This is the Remington Armory in 1874. It's a rare photograph from a book Remington made, had photographers of the time painstakingly make, that they gave to their gun salesmen as they went around the world to show foreign governments and armies just how big Remington was. That this was really a big deal company. It's in Ilion, New York, which is on the Erie Canal. It's the only real big gun maker that's not in New England, and maybe that was an advantage, maybe it wasn't. Anyhow, that armory was built in stages over time. It just closed. Remington moved to Ilion in 1828, and I think it was last year, maybe it was even this year, a private equity company moved out of Ilion, and for the first time in almost 200 years, this armory went silent, and no longer were Remington guns made in Ilion, which I find sad, but who knows. This is a rare photo. This is what the barrel machine room at the armory looked like. And for anyone who's a real machinist nerd, you'll love this picture. In the back on the left, those are drill presses. I don't know if you can see the wheels, but that's the drill press because you drilled vertically, and the press was a weight, usually, often a cannonball, at the top, giving you your constant force down. These are barrels waiting to be worked on. There's a rack of, you see those? Those are probably for rifling, because there's a rifling machine at the far right. And there is a rifling machine here at the museum, maybe you've seen, that does exactly this. And the barrels come in, they bore them, maybe those even are rods for reaming, they then rifle them, and then they move on. Remington ended up with an enormous capacity. In fact, after Springfield, which was the largest arms plant on earth at the end of the Civil War, Remington was a close second. I mentioned the foreign sales. As they ramped up, Remington made sales to Denmark, Sweden, Norway. Providence Tool had a good sale to Switzerland of its rifle, which is called a Peabody rifle. And so there started to be some orders. But then the big opportunity came in 1870, and this was the Franco-Prussian War. And France foolishly declared war on Prussia, not realizing that was a very bad move. And within 6 weeks, its armies had been destroyed, mostly captured, and it had no weapons. It was using a very good rifle called the Chassepot. It had bad ammunition because the French could not draw metallic cartridges in the way we saw earlier, but it was a very fine rifle nonetheless. They didn't capitulate. Government left Paris, went to, I think, Tours, tried to put together new armies and needed weapons. And gee, who was there? Well, Marcellus Hartley was there. He said, he sort of saw it coming. He'd been stockpiling arms, and he sent 2 arms salesmen to Paris and got a very lucrative contract, but by then the Prussians had surrounded the city. So how do you get yourself and your arms contract out of town? Well, you can see how they did it. The balloon in front is Leon Gambetta, who was the president of France, and with a couple of his aides. The one in the back, though, Charles May found left over from an earlier exhibition and bought, and he and another one of Marcellus Hartley's salesmen, a guy named W.W. Reynolds, got in the balloon, and off they went together, floating over the very angry Prussian troops who tried to shoot at them and then chased them with cavalry, only then learning even a hot air balloon goes pretty fast. And they got away. The contract was duly sent to New York, and Marcellus Hartley started shipping arms. However, the real winner there was Samuel Remington, because France hired him as its agent for anything he could get his hands on, and he went to work quite successfully. He sold France in a very short period of time 155,000 rolling block rifles. He had Providence Tool on contract for 33,000 Peabodys, Winchester and Colt and Whitney Arms, anybody that can make a gun. And when they ran out of those, they raided the government. Well, they shouldn't say raided. They went to the Ordnance Department. It turned out Congress wanted to pay down some Civil War debt, and the War Department had some guns. And I think 400,000, if it may be a slight exaggeration, Springfield rifles, muzzle-loading rifles, went to France, as well as prodigious quantities of everything else. It filled 25 steamships. During that period, no commercial ship left New York Harbor on time. And by the way, those were steamships from New York. There also were ships from elsewhere. They sold Gatling guns, you name it. But even that wasn't enough. So through some trickery, Remington talked the federal government into making guns for France under various pretexts. I talk about it in the book, but for a while, the U.S. Springfield and the U.S. ammo plant in Philadelphia were working overtime to make stuff for the French. It didn't do them any good. When they went to see Bismarck, they said, "Would you like any guns?" And he said, "I'm going to get them for free from the French before long," which he did. And we talked about Russia, and of course, Russia became a big customer. It was first of all, ordered its first toe in the water was 30,000 rifles, Berdan rifles from Colt. The Russians were very finicky about the rifles. They rejected a lot. So one of the things France got was an enormous number. I think it was 12,000 rejected Berdan rifles, among other things. They also ordered Gatling guns. They probably got about 100 from here. They had them made and licensed in Europe. And finally, they began making them on their own. Dr. Gatling even lived in St. Petersburg for a while. Their big hit, though, pardon me, was Smith & Wesson. They needed a cavalry revolver. They decided that the Smith & Wesson Model 3 was what they want, and they got directly from Smith & Wesson over 130,000 of those. The Tsar's youngest son was a sort of ne'er-do-well, although an admiral nonetheless, the Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich, who came over to see the U.S. in 1872. And he went everywhere, but one of the places he went was the cartridge factory. And the reason these ladies are wearing nice dresses is that the Grand Duke came to see their factory. And they had never met or seen a member of European royalty before. So they put on their finest clothing. According to accounts, they tied ribbons on the machinery and were very honored, to which the Grand Duke commented only, "I'm so surprised at how well-dressed American workers are." He had a very good sense of humor. I don't think he was, fooled by the whole thing. He went on from there to Smith & Wesson, which gave him a beautiful ivory-handled revolver. And if you look on his right hip, you can see that revolver. He was very proud of it. In silver, it had the Russian arms on one side, and I think the U.S. on the other. He is here with George Armstrong Custer, because word got out that Alexei wanted to go on a buffalo hunt, and no one knew what to do. It went all the way up to the top of the War Department, which was General Sherman, who then told General Sheridan to arrange it. And so Sheridan put together a very elaborate operation, we talk in the book about this, to go to Nebraska to hunt buffalo. But he decided he needed a real buffalo hunter, so he hired Buffalo Bill Cody, who there are also photographs of him, to go with the Grand Duke and a whole band of Sioux Indians under a chief called Spotted Tail, who demanded 10,000 rations of tobacco, among other things, but did it. And so there was this expedition in the dead of winter in Nebraska. Custer obviously was along, where the Grand Duke, Custer, Buffalo Bill, and all the Indians went around shooting buffalo. It was a wonderful success, at least that far. But what happened next was what to me was the most interesting part of the whole story. It's the disagreement among these four people. And in order, it's the Khedive Ismail, who was the Viceroy of Egypt, the Sultan of Turkey, Abdulaziz, the Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, and the redoubtable Queen Victoria, who, by the way, was tougher than all the rest of them combined. Egypt was the center of the world for a couple of reasons then. One was during the Civil War, cotton had been cut off, but cotton was grown in Egypt, and Egypt sold immense quantities, and Ismail, by some counts, was the wealthiest man in the world. He was a vassal of the Sultan and didn't like it and wanted to become independent, so he hired at least 40 veteran Confederate and Union officers, quite a few generals, to come to Egypt to train his army and to lead his army in war. And he somehow found Samuel Remington or vice versa and began buying prodigious quantities of rolling blocks from Remington, probably about 175,000 of them. And they even opened factories in Egypt. The British got word of this and shut it down, but not before Ismail had spent himself into bankruptcy and before other things had also happened. Ismail then turned his sights on Darfur and South Sudan, and you can imagine how successful it would be to try to invade those places, but he did try. But the thing that really upset these four people in different ways was the opening of the Suez Canal in November of 1869. Because Britain's great possession was India, and you got to India by sailing around Africa, and Britain had a chain of naval bases and a navy to protect that trade route. But once the Suez Canal gets opened, you don't need the bases, and the whole maritime equation changes. In fact, now it's the Eastern Mediterranean that makes a difference, and the Eastern Mediterranean is ruled by the Sultan of Turkey. But the Sultan of Turkey was bankrupt, and his empire was falling apart, and the Tsar of Russia very much wanted to conquer Turkey and capture the straits so that the warships could go from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and put pressure on England. And that was something Queen Victoria said, if the Russians ever appear in Constantinople, I will abdicate. And she was not, by the way, a figurehead or a retiring character. I've actually read a lot of her correspondence. She was all over things, very well informed, extremely tough, and knew just what she was doing. So what happens is that we have, oh, and by the way, I should have added, the Tsar made no secret of the fact he intended to attack Turkey. He said openly, I'm going to attack Turkey, I'm going to defeat it, and I'm doing that just to be a nice guy to the Christians there, but everyone knew he really wanted to capture the straits so his warships could come and go. So what do? Well, the European powers began pressuring Turkey to rearm, and that started in the early 1870s. Turkey bought 200,000, 250,000 maybe, surplus Springfield rifles and converted them to the Snyder system, but they needed a real weapon. The first stab was to buy rifles and carbines from Oliver Winchester, but that wasn't enough. So in 1872, they announced gun trials in Constantinople, and everyone knew this would be the largest arms contract of them all. And so gun salesmen swarmed to Constantinople, and Turkey was famous for the corruption of its officials, and the diplomatic correspondence and other correspondence speaks of the rampant corruption and bribery that was going on during the gun trials. And so Oliver Winchester was there, and Samuel Remington was there, Hiram Berdan was there, everybody went. And it really came down to 2 or 3 American guns. And then the Sultan announced one day, none of you win. I'm going to adopt the British military rifle, the Martini Henry. And people said, well, you haven't even tested the Martini Henry. It's not even a mature weapon yet. But word got out that what had happened was that a British general who had just left service to start kind of government-sanctioned arms company had snuck into the palace and presented the Sultan with a gilded Martini Henry. And he said, oh, that's what I'm going to buy. The problem was only Americans could make this gun. And so they adopted a British gun that the British couldn't make and frankly was not quite ready. Oliver Winchester won the contract for the first 100,000 by underbidding his competitor by 1 shilling. It was alleged it's because he had bribed the translator or the telegraph operator to learn the price. He came over quite pleased with himself, only to have the man in the middle, John Anthony of Providence Tool Company, said, but I, sir, own the patent on that. Winchester said, you'll sell it to me. Anthony said, I will not. And even though Providence Tool had thought it was exiting the gun business, it stuck with it, wouldn't give in, and got it. The man on the right is J.P. Morgan. That's the source of the funding for Providence Tool to build out its armory. Here's the gun. This is the American version, the Peabody Martini. It was a little bit better than the British version, slightly smaller chamber, and all metallic cartridge. It was a devastating weapon, many reports of soldiers dying at 2,000 yards from shots from this gun. It used a very heavy bullet, an outsized powder charge, a bottleneck cartridge, which was they'd been invented before. This is the first gun to use it as extensively. It was British soldiers didn't like it because it would give you a bloody nose. A lot of the Turks put it under their arm because it could break your shoulder, but events would prove its value. Providence Tool built out its armory. The armory's still there in Rhode Island. It's only about 150 yards off of I-95. I love these engravings. There's so much in them. The piles of coal, the 2 guys shaking hands. See the train? That's still the Amtrak line. If you take the Amtrak from Providence to Boston, you go right by. You can reach out and touch the Providence Tool factory. But you can go see it. It's still there. It's quite impressive. It's bigger than this. Providence Tool ended up making 625,000 Peabody Martinis. And they did it in the space of about 5 years. It would have been faster, but the Turks couldn't pay, and they were chronically late in payment. So Providence Tool would make the guns, pledge them to J.P. Morgan, who'd advance them the money to make more guns. And then when the Turks got really desperate, they'd come up with the money, they'd get some of their guns, and so it went. But the invasion of Turkey did happen. There was an army in eastern Turkey, and the main army came through Bulgaria. It was commanded by the man on the left, who's the Tsar's brother, and that's Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich. And they crossed the Danube quite easily. They overwhelmed the Turkish defenses, and it just seemed that there was nothing between this Russian army and Constantinople. Nothing, that is, except the man on the right. And that man is Field Marshal Osman Nuri Pasha, thought by many to be the greatest general in the history of Turkey. There was a race to a crossroads town called Plevna. Osman got there first by a few hours. The Russians didn't know what they were doing. They thought he had a small force. They attacked him. A regiment was destroyed on July 20th. 10 days later, they mounted an even bigger attack. It got wiped out. The Tsar came to watch it, and they decided that the third decisive attack would be on his birthday, September 11th. There were 120,000 Russian troops and about 30 or 40,000 Romanians, hundreds of Krupp cannon, and this was going to be the end of that. That's the third battle of Plevna right there. It was a devastating defeat for the Russians. And this is the final attack on one of the redoubts, the Grevitska redoubt, which is the key to the Turkish position. The reason I like this photo is everybody, and this is, you see, Romanians coming over the top, Turks in the fort, firing into the fort, and on the far left are Russians. See the white? Everybody's carrying an American gun. All the ammunition is from Connecticut. The whole thing. Russians are carrying Berdans, either made by Colt or made by license in England or Russia. Turks, Peabody Martinis. Romanians, the Peabody rifles. Both sides are carrying Smith & Wesson revolvers. Both sides had Gatling guns. And there's Snyder rifles, an invention of an American named Jacob Snyder. So here we are in Bulgaria in 1877, and one of the more decisive battles fought in Europe in those years, in the middle of nowhere by American thinking, all these weapons meet. And what happens is the Russians are rebuffed. Finally, they besiege Plevna, the garrison surrenders. They get to Constantinople, confident they're at their goal, but gee whiz, Queen Victoria has ordered the British fleet to go there and says it will be war. So they leave, and Russia to this day does not have control of the streets. The ending of the story, it's funny, the industry in a way considered itself to have reached its peak in 1876. This is when they had the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, the emblem in a way of which is this mammoth Corliss engine which powered everything. It was built in Providence across an alley from the Providence Tool Company Armory, strangely enough. All the American firms had big exhibits there, but what no one, maybe they knew, it was all over by then. There were no more big arms contracts to anybody. Samuel Remington came back to America, as did a lot of the other gun people, and slowly the big companies went out of business. Remington was declared insolvent maybe 1884-85, sold at a knockdown price to Winchester and Marcellus Hartley. In 1886, Providence Tool had been liquidated 1 year earlier. And with that, the saga of the American arms industry comes to a close. Thank you. And I see I talked for too long, so I'm very sorry about that. But I meant to leave more time for questions, but sorry. Anyhow, I'm all yours. Don't all talk at once. Yes.
Yes, you mentioned in passing the Gatling gun.
Yes.
What impact did rapid-fire weapons like the Gatling gun have on these European wars? We know that there was some effort in the Civil War to introduce them, but
Yeah.
what about in Europe?
Actually, surprisingly,
Massive gun, I know.
yeah, surprisingly little for the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun was basically a bundle of muskets, and what made it work so well was a fascinating breech mechanism that Richard Gatling had developed. And some say he based it on a seed drill. He was a big inventor, invented a lot of agricultural machinery. Some say it was just a modification of a seed drill, but I've never seen that. The thing about the Gatling gun that had a couple of shortcomings. It weighed a lot. It was a piece of small artillery, really. It had to be in a carriage, usually pulled by a couple of horses. Needed a crew of 2. And cartridges or metallic ammunition was still expensive. And so its prodigious rate of fire, they knew back then what it could do. I mean, there were always things like, well, no one knew till jet planes. No, ordnance officers hooked that thing up to steam engines early on. You know, these guys, let's face it, are real nerds. And they just wanted to see what it would do. And of course, they saw it would fire 1,000 rounds a minute. The problem is you could only put 60 or 70 in the thing. But the problem is ammunition's heavy and expensive. And its big competitor was just the normal field piece, which could be fired about 5 times a minute. And they even did studies. It cost about $4 to fire a canister shot, whereas if you put in a big hopper full of cartridges, it was going to cost more. It was tested all the time. It was used successfully really in 2 areas. One, the British put it on gunboats, where it worked very well. And the Russians apparently used it to great effect in their, after they lost the Russo-Turkish War, Russia turned eastward and began conquering the stands, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan. That's where it sent its army. And apparently it was successful in that. But people were absolutely fascinated by the Gatling gun. There were Gatling guns that fired 1-inch shells. There were Gatling guns made to put on the back of camels. There were Gatling guns made for police departments to suppress riots. You name it, there was a Gatling gun for it. And as you've seen them, they're beautiful. They're beautiful museums. But then what happened was another American, Hiram Maxim, came along with a Maxim gun. Rate of fire was fine, didn't weigh that much, and that really took over. And then you had the other guns too. In World War I, all three machine gun designs were American, because Benjamin Hotchkiss, although he had moved to France, was an American, and of course John Browning was the third. So,
Thank you.
yes?
If you'd like to see one of those Gatling cannons, they've got two of them in the Bradford County courthouse.
Oh, really?
Just inside the front door. And I know that you have to go back back towards Washington, D.C. You could pass right past it if you'd like.
Well, I'd like to see. I've seen a few. I mean, they're here and there. I mean, around. But yeah, the workmanship is exquisite on those.
Totally agree.
Yeah, quite lovely. Yes.
When you describe those, all the American companies going out of business towards the later part of the 1800s, who picked up the slack? I mean, eventually, did Europe start to learn how to machine?
Yeah, I mean, no major power wanted to be dependent on private companies across an ocean. So a few things happened. One was that the American companies failed to come up with a follow-on design. Europeans had never had trouble with bolt-action guns. I mean, the needle gun was bolt-action, the Chassepot. Over here, the thinking, wrong as we now know, was the amount of sliding surfaces made those guns very susceptible to jamming when sand or something got into them. But that was really the future. And the Mauser brothers, who actually were under contract to one of Remington's salesmen for a long time, came up with a good bolt-action gun, and as anyone who follows guns knows, the rest is history. Remington came up with the Remington Lee, which was also a good gun, invented the metallic box magazine, but the Americans beyond that didn't succeed. Winchester in 1885 had its gun strengthened by a John Browning design, but it never became a military gun. So what happened was basically it was Mauser and companies making Mausers that took over the market, and the Americans never got it back. For all the talk about, well, look at all these American gun companies, they were pretty small in the rest of the 19th century by comparison, because the Belgians in particular grew their capacity a lot, as did the British. But one of the nice things that did come out of it was the sewing machine. Everybody had a sewing machine line, and that kept a lot of people going. So, yes?
The American arms industry did recover eventually because, I mean, Smith & Wesson's still a name, Remington,
Yeah.
Winchester, Colt, they're all still names in manufacturing.
They're still names. They just weren't back. They weren't at the scale. Was the reason. I mean, Remington became a sporting goods company. It ballooned during World War I and World War II because it got contracts, but they were reasonably small. Winchester was chiefly an ammunition company, although they made these rifles. There were other sporting good companies, but there was, a market for revolvers and so on. What was the problem, though, was, the Union had bought an enormous number of revolvers, and they dumped these Colts and Remingtons in the market for $2 or $3. So if you see the old cowboy movies, they're carrying the old Colts, and you think, like, well, that was stupid. They could get a Smith & Wesson. And the answer is no, because a Smith & Wesson in today's money is like $500, whereas a Colt is $25, and so on. The companies persisted, but they didn't get back to the scale they'd had, I think is maybe the answer. Well, oh, yes.
Were there companies that specialized in big guns, cannons and artillery and things like this, or was the market just too small?
The American market was mostly small arms. There were, any number of reasons for it, but one of the breakthroughs was the Krupp breech-loading steel cannon. Now that used something called the Broadwell closure, which was done by an American named Broadwell, who had a patent, but the Krupp people didn't care and just stole the idea. But the U.S. went into a long period something about, I'm no expert on any of this. There was a certain national nausea about the Civil War, and the sheer 2% of the population have been killed. And if you extrapolate that into young men, it's much bigger. And if you go through the census records of 1870, it's just astonishing the number of cripples, the number of households with no male. And there was not much defense spending after that in this country. So arms development really moved to Europe. That's why Hiram Maxim and Benjamin Hotchkiss both moved there. And because the Europeans were getting in an arms race, getting ready for World War I. In terms of large cannon, the Navy was building bigger and bigger naval cannon, I mean huge, and that was, the big ones were made either at Watervliet or in the Washington Naval Yard, you know, getting up to 12 and even bigger cannon. The Army was sort of behind until the 1930s, when they kind of reformed the artillery, thank God, because in World War I they were basically relying on, you know, copies of European cannons. But that's beyond anything I know, so don't believe anything I just told you. As I told you, everything for me stops in 1885. Anyhow, no more questions. Thank you very much. Oh, hold on. There's a.
I have one more.
Okay.
Emphasis on machining in your work. Who was casting? Where was the casting going on? And making the raw rods that made the the rifle barrels and things like that.
Yeah, they began historically. Rifle barrels were made of wrought iron. Starting in about the 1840s in England, the 1850s here, and then in earnest during the Civil War, they began rolling barrels instead of forging them. And that required a quality of iron we didn't have. They'd always used iron from the Salisbury Range, which runs west of here, from Vermont down to New York. It's too high in phosphorus to roll. So they imported what was called Marshall iron. Basically, it's a company named Marshall in Widnesbury, England, made it. But that wasn't really from England, it was from Russia or Sweden. They imported high-quality iron ore and processed it into steel and made these slabs called scalps that were shipped over. What was left over from the rifle, from the barrel making, went to the rest of the guns. So the quality of steel in Civil War guns is extremely high. It wasn't till later that Pennsylvania steel makers learned how to make steel of that quality. But actually, most of the iron in the Peabody Martinis was still coming from England. So it would go to the various armories. They all had foundries. That's why they kept burning down, because, I mean, the coal burned down in 1864, and they're always burning down. And they would actually heat the iron there, and then they would use a drop forge or sometimes a tilt hammer, depending on what they were making, to create the forging. And then, of course, they'd apply it to a milling machine or whatever to get it to dimension, and so on. So. Okay, well, thank you very much. You're a wonderful audience. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much. It was informative and enlightening. Just to remind everybody, we have Geoffrey's book for sale over there. If you're interested, I'm sure he'd be willing to sign it. And I know some people. Our next in the speaker series is October 16th. Simon Winchester, the author of The Precisionist. I'm sorry, The Perfectionist. It's all about precision, though. That's where I get it from, The Perfectionist. So, yes, please feel free to walk around the museum for a little bit and ask any questions you have. But again, thank you all for coming. It was a great evening. And thank you to Lisa there for arranging all of this as well.
Thank you, Lisa.